Most people don't live their lives. They simulate them while waiting for a certainty that never arrives. We call this confusion, but it's not. It's negotiation. To understand why we stay stuck, we must look at the physics of the mind. In computing, there's a concept called background processing. When you leave a program open but don't use it, it still consumes RAM. It drains the battery. It slows the entire system. Every undecided path in your life is an open loop. When you keep your options open, you aren't being flexible. You are suffering from cognitive leakage. Your brain is subconsciously simulating 5 different lives at once, trying to predict 5 different outcomes and failing to power the one you're actually standing in. We have been sold a lie that optionality is wealth. In reality, optionality is a debt you pay with your attention. This is why you feel tired even when you've done nothing. You're exhausted from working, you're exhausted from the weight of the lives you haven't had the courage to kill yet. There's a moment that doesn't look like much. No announcement, no visible shift, just a quiet recognition. You already know what to do, and yet you don't move. Not because you're confused, not because you lack information, but because something else is happening. You're still negotiating. We like to believe that decisions come from clarity, that once we figure it out, we act. But that's not how it works, because clarity is rarely the problem. Most people already know. They know when something is over. They know when something doesn't fit anymore. They know when it's time to move, and still they hesitate. They compare, they analyze, they reopen the same question again and again. As if one more thought will finally resolve it, but it doesn't, because the real tension is not about information. It is about elimination. The word decision comes from the Latin decidere, literally to cut off. To decide is not to select a path. It is to eliminate all others. And this is why decision is not just psychological, it is energetic. A decision returns force to the life you're actually living. Every real choice carries a quiet violence, not toward the world, but toward possibility. Because the moment you commit, everything else disappears. Not theoretically, actually. And that is what most people avoid. Not the wrong decision, but the loss of alternatives. Because alternatives create a sense of safety. As long as multiple paths remain open, nothing is final. Nothing is at stake. You can still imagine a different version of your life without having to live it. And that illusion is comforting. So instead of deciding, you optimize. You weigh options. You search for the best scenario, the perfect combination of freedom and stability, risk and safety, movement and control. But that combination does not exist, because every real decision closes doors. And once those doors close, something else happens. Responsibility begins. Modern culture teaches us to keep options open, but not to carry the weight of choosing. So people learn to delay, explain, outsource, and wait for certainty, or their life gets shaped by default. This is where Søren Kierkegaard becomes precise. Kierkegaard understood something uncomfortable. To choose is not to gain a path. It is to lose all others. We are the first generation that believes keeping options open is a form of freedom. It isn't. It is a form of paralysis that allows the system to decide for you. We are entering a culture of permanent optionality, where everything is available and nothing is entered. Jean-Paul Sartre identified the trap. Human beings are condemned to choose. Even when you don't decide, you are deciding. Because not choosing is also a form of commitment. A commitment to staying, to maintaining the current structure, to delaying change. And that has consequences. Because time does not pause while you think. It moves, and every moment you remain undecided, you're shaping a life by default. Not the one you choose, but the one you allowed. This is why indecision feels strangely heavy. not because nothing is happening, but because something is happening without your authorship. You're being carried instead of moving. And the longer this continues, the harder it becomes to break. Because the system stabilizes around your inaction. Your environment adapts, your habits reinforce themselves, your identity begins to align with staying, until movement no longer feels like a choice, but like a disruption. And humans fear disruptions more than they hate stagnation. So you stay, not because it's right, but because it's stable. This is where Friedrich Nietzsche cuts deeper. Becoming who you are is not a process of addition. It is a process of reduction, of cutting away, of removing what does not belong, until something coherent remains. But without the cut, nothing is removed. Everything stays possible. And when everything stays possible, nothing becomes real. This is the paradox of modern life. We have more options than ever before, more places, more paths, more identities, and yet less movement. Because options create hesitation. The more you can choose, the harder it becomes to choose. Not because a decision is complex, but because the cost is visible. You see what you will lose, and so you wait. You keep evaluating, as if the right moment will arrive. A moment where the decision feels obvious, clean, without consequence. But that moment never comes. Because a real decision never feels complete. It always carries uncertainty, always contains doubt, always leaves something unresolved. That is not a flaw. That is the nature of decision itself. And the people who move are not the ones who feel certain. They are the ones who accept that certainty will never arrive and act anyway. The future will not belong to those with the most options. It will belong to those who can eliminate. This is where something shifts. Decisions stop being about finding the right path and becomes about ending negotiation, ending the internal conversation that keeps everything open. Because as long as you're negotiating, you're not living. You're simulating possibilities, running scenarios, imagining outcomes, but not entering any of them. And that creates a strange distance. You're close to your life, but not inside it. Watching it, evaluating it, but not committing to it. Until something breaks that loop, not through logic, but through a different kind of clarity. The recognition that there is no perfect decision. Only a moment where you stop asking and start acting. Not because the answer is complete, but because the question has run its course. And that moment is quiet. It doesn't feel like certainty. It feels like alignment. A point where hesitation no longer holds, where something in you stops negotiating. And once that happens, movement becomes simple. Not easy, but direct, because the alternatives are no longer competing. They're gone. And in that absence, something else appears. Weight, reality, a life that is no longer theoretical, but lived. This is why decision changes everything. Not because it guarantees a better outcome, but because it creates an outcome at all. It turns potential into structure, and structure is what allows something to exist. Without it, everything remains abstract, possible, but never real. So the question is no longer, what is the best choice? Because that question keeps you in negotiation. The real question is, what am I no longer willing to keep open? What am I ready to close so something else can begin? Because that is where decision lives, not in perfect reasoning, but in the willingness to eliminate. And in a world that teaches you to keep every option alive, that might be the most radical act left. This is part of the TOMAAS prophecies, cinematic essays that don't just reflect the world, but decode the forces shaping how we move through it. Art isn't decoration, it's intel. If something here stayed with you, drop the thought it triggered, even a single sentence. And if these reflections resonate, subscribe for the next prophecy. Because a life only begins the moment other lives are rejected. If you're drawn to the visual work behind these ideas, You can explore more of my digital artworks and original photography at TOMAAS.com.